All right, if you haven't responded yet, please quickly respond to the clicker question. Yes? 44. I wish there was a way I could make this bigger. That's 44 right up there. Well, we're finishing it up. Who had a particularly good weekend? What'd you do? Nothing's nice. Nothing's very good. Did anybody do something? What was exciting? What's that? Where do you work?
Yeah, I'm not going to say that.
Okay, fair enough.
Y'all didn't know that.
Anybody else? Really? Nobody did anything?
Well, I went to the dentist.
Well, okay, you guys have such a perverse definition of fun. Somebody give me something that was actually fun. Yeah, that's right. How'd the meet go? Good. Good. What distance do you run again? 800. All right, take 37 more seconds to finish it up. It's not until exam day that you realize how many people just don't come to class. It's all right, y'all are getting extra credit and they're not. 5, 4, 3, 1. All right. So what should you have done? Which of these answers? C. Yes. Remember we talked about the testing effect, and we'll talk more about it today as we're talking about memory. But rereading the book, looking over your notes, and watching the lectures are not good ways of studying because all you're doing is testing whether or not you recognize the material rather than whether you can regurgitate that material. So, just because C was the right answer doesn't mean you aren't all going to get credit for participating. But we're going to talk today about the absolute benefit of doing things like using flashcards and why there's like a 20% benefit in grade, like a 2-letter grade benefit of doing things with flashcards. So, if you weren't happy with your performance on this exam, remember A, you get to drop it. But B, let's work on good study strategies for the next test. So let me close out of this real quick, disconnect. All right. So today we are talking about memory. Exam 1 performance was not that great. There was 1 perfect score, and then a handful of people that only missed 1 problem. And so there was no curve. About a quarter of people got an A or a B on the exam, but you can see the breakdown here for the rest of the grades. So, to regurgitate good study strategies, the next 2 lectures are all going to be things that can help you with that actual retention. But things like space out your study, don't cram, don't pull an all-nighter. Like 35% of y'all said you didn't study. So not studying is obviously inferior to actually studying. But you want to space out your studying, and then you want to test yourself. And again, we're going to go over the testing effect substantially today. But if there's anything you can pull away from this week's lecture, it's how to actually study well for exams both in this class and exams in other classes as well. What exams do you have about questions? What questions do you have about the exam? And if anybody hasn't actually seen this interview, it is the most painful thing you'd ever watch. Somebody's got to have a question, or you're all just reading the transcript. Yeah.
Will we be able to see the exams, see what we missed?
Good question. So I don't want to take up class time with actually handing back the exams, because that would take a lot of time. But please, please, please come to my office. I'm more than happy to sit down and go over your exam question by question. We can go over what you missed. Your best bets for that would either be coming to office hours or shooting me an email to set up a time to actually sit down and go over the exam together. Don't just drop by because I may not be there. I may not have all that much time, so send me an email. We'll find a time to actually sit down and go over your exam. I definitely do want to go over your exam with you, so don't mistake the fact that I am not handing it back in class as an indication that I don't want you to figure out what you got wrong, because I'm a very lazy final exam grader, or writer rather, and so if I have the opportunity to repurpose questions, I most likely will. So it would behoove you to go over things that you missed at this point. What are the questions you have? Did anybody think the exam was particularly unfair? I've got thick skin, so you can tell me if there were things you didn't like about the exam. I promise it's not a trick. I'm not going to fail you if you speak up. Is that a hand? No, you're just stretching. All right. Well, if you do have questions or concerns about the exam, come talk to me. Again, remember, if you screwed up on this one, you get to drop it. So it's not the end of the world. You're starting over from square one. But don't screw up the next one if you screwed up the first one, because you're not going to get to drop that one either. All right. Here's your fun fact of the day. The Supreme Court has its own private basketball court on the top floor, and it's been nicknamed the highest court in the land. Ah, God, that gets me every time. It's a bad pun meme thing. I'm hip and happening, okay? Just let me have it. Alright. So when we're studying memory, we've got three specific or distinct approaches that we can kind of define memory as. Right? Remember when we talk about things like operationalization? We can operationalize memory as three different kind of subcomponents here of recall, we'll go over that in just a minute, recognition, and then relearning. So memory is not just this single construct, but rather represents different conceptualizations. Recall is the free, unaided retrieval of information. So if I said blank was the first president of the United States, who was it?
George Washington.
Perfect. I'm glad nobody said anything obviously wrong. Yes, so right there you're using recall. Right? There's no real aiding in the actual process of pulling that information from memory. You can also have things like processes, right? So what's the process for changing the oil in your car? So in this case, I'm requiring you to pull that information out of your memory with no sorts of aids, right? So this would be analogous to doing an open-ended or free response exam, wherein I ask a question and you've got to write the answers. When you're doing recall type exams, or when you're doing any sort of testing based off of recall, performance tends to be lower, right? Because it's harder to pull information out that has no sort of either priming or recognition that we'll talk about in just a second. So who can give me an example, another example of a recall type question? Yeah?
Most history exams.
What's that?
Most history exams.
Most history exams. I'll take your word for it. It's been like 14 years since I took a history exam. So, perfect. Recognition, on the other hand, is a process by which you're primed with the right answer and wrong ones as well. So for example, if I asked you which classroom your psychology class is taught in, there's one right answer and then 3 wrong answers. And so you don't actually have to necessarily know the room, you just have to be able to recognize the right answer. So the nice thing about recognition type questions or recognition exams is you don't really have to know the information all that well. Which is one of the reasons I have a little hesitation when people ask me, how's the exam going to be structured? Is it going to be multiple choice or is it going to be open-ended free response? Because telling you it's going to be multiple choice makes people assume that they can rely on that recognition. Right? And that's why tough multiple choice exams are usually things that are pulling in other terms you're going to recognize to kind of compete with that recognition of, oh yeah, that must be the right answer because I recognize that answer there. So who can give me a recognition type question that is not multiple choice? Yeah.
Maybe like matching vocabulary words or something like that?
Yeah, matching vocabulary words, right? So I have 2 different lists, a list of the word, list of definitions, and I ask you to draw the connection. You could also have things like true or false, wherein you've got either a right or a wrong answer, and you can rely on that recognition indication internally to say, oh yeah, that seems familiar, oh yeah, I recognize that, that's probably the right answer. And then relearning is an evaluation method by which we determine how quickly you can pick back up that information the next time you learn it. So for example, if you learned to read music as a kid, but stopped, and then now that you're in college decide, you know, I want to pick up the piano again, you're going to be quicker to reacquire those skills than you were to acquire those skills in the first place. Who can give me a real-world example in their lives of that relearning benefit? Yeah?
Math.
Math? Yeah. All right, and so maybe you took calculus in high school and then just forgot all about it. Now you have to take calculus in college. It becomes easier the second time you take it, even if you couldn't regurgitate the right answers kind of unaided before you took calculus a second time. The process by which you're relearning establishes that it's in your memory bank somewhere, and now you're just kind of solidifying those pathways. Questions between those 3 distinctions? Cool. So, I realize we talked about the testing effect before. We're talking about study strategies. But I didn't hammer home just how remarkable the benefit is for testing yourself. So, in this study itself, they gave everyone, I think it was a word list to, facts to study. And then, after 7 minutes of study, they either studied more or they took a test. And what you can see is 5 minutes after that secondary study or that secondary test, there is a slight benefit for having studied more. Probably just a function of the fact that they spent more time looking over the material, so it was not just a one-time or a two-time exposure. But after 2 days, you see about a 15% benefit for having not studied during that time, but taken a test right after they studied. Right? So that's a letter grade and a half benefit for taking a practice test after that initial exposure. And it persists. Even a week later, their benefit for having actually taken a test rather than studying is about 15%. And interestingly enough, it's as good after a week after taking that practice test as it was after just 2 days following that initial study. Right, so this benefit can jump your grade from a C to an A by simply testing yourself. You can take a practice test in the book, like what we have with Cengage, right? That's, despite all my qualms with Cengage that I'm quickly learning throughout the semester, that is one of the benefits of forcing you to take these tests to enhance retention in the long run. What you see here is a secondary study, a very similar structure, where they had a retrieval practice, so they actually had to regurgitate that, I think this was the word list one, regurgitate those words, or just reread that word list. And what you see is a 25% jump in performance based off of that actual retrieval of that information. Rather than spending that additional time studying, taking that test enhance that retrieval down the line. The really cool thing about this is it enhances retrieval for things you're not even tested on, right? And so if you go, you study whatever you're studying this class, and then you test yourself, things that are related concepts that you're not even testing yourself on, you still have a retrieval benefit for on that secondary test, right? And so here you're seeing about an 8% increase for things that you didn't even study again nor take the test on, but just because it's peripherally related and you started to cement those neural pathways, allowing retrieval to come easier, you're getting this substantial and significant benefit. Right? It's easy to think, oh, okay, that's a small jump. We're going from 43 to 49% proportion. But think about what that means in terms of letter grades, right? I mean, that's almost an entire letter grade benefit for just testing yourself rather than spending that extra time studying. Questions so far? Awesome. So there are a handful of ways you can actually perform these sort of tests, right? I mean, one thing is to take an actual practice exam. As we'll talk about next time, taking a practice exam has additional benefit because it allows you to simulate the environment in which you'll be forced to regurgitate that information or recall that information. But it can also be things like flashcards, right? So if you're doing definitional-based studying, you have the word on one side, definition on the other, forcing yourself to recall that definition rather than just recognize that definition as you would be if you're reading through your notes or rereading the book or rewatching the lectures, allows you to enhance that retrieval. One of the things I also like to do is say, okay, I know decision making is going to be on the exam, so let me write down everything I know about decision making. Right? So now you're casting a really wide net for that retrieval practice, which means it's an even wider net for those tangentially related, non-tested, or non-recalled items. Now, I know there are some of y'all, because I get this every semester, who says, yeah, but I just don't feel like I'm learning it, so that probably doesn't work for me. We can look. This is just that testing effect here. So the red bar is reading, right? So over those 4 periods, green is 3 reading and then a single testing. And then you have this blue, which is a single reading, but 3 subsequent tests. And you see that about 20 percentage point increase. But when you ask people, did it help me? People think that rereading helps them, even though their performance doesn't indicate that, right? And so this is one of these situations wherein your subjective experience does not align with the objective reality. So everybody is feeling like, okay, this provides a substantial benefit for me to reread and reread and go over it again. Because what you're doing is allowing yourself to have this recognition, kind of artificially inflate your sense of knowledge. Right? Every subsequent time you reread something, it feels like, yeah, I know it. I recognize that. I can finish that sentence. But in reality, you're not getting the performance benefits associated with reading it only once and testing yourself on it multiple times. I feel like Roediger and Karpicki should pay me for being their disciple. If I could write a Bible on the testing effect and hand it out, I would, absolutely. Who has questions about ways to implement the testing effect for their own study or anything else? I hope I'm hammering home what absolute benefit this is for your study strategies. You don't even have to study as long this way. You get better benefit and less study time. Are you buying what I'm selling here? You'll take 10? Perfect. It's not a pyramid scheme, I promise. Alright. So let me step off my soapbox here about the testing effect. We're going to talk about a 3-stage model for memory, kind of popularized by Atkinson and Shiffrin. So we hear it referred to as the Atkinson and Shiffrin model of memory. The first stage is this sensory memory. And so we record, I'm going to put record in quotes because as you'll see next time, our memory is incredibly fallible. We don't actually record anything. We kind of repopulate what we think happened, but it's really inaccurate. So we quote unquote record the information that could be remembered as sensory information. I'm going to show you a really cool example here in just a minute to highlight the fact that for a short period immediately after being exposed to information, you still have the ability to re-access information that you're not consciously aware of, right? This is the scientific example of you saying what to a friend and then realizing you actually know what they said. So you say, what? I mean, no, I know what you meant. Right? Because now you have access to that information still in your sensory loop, and you can go back, re-access it, reprocess it, and now share an answer. So we then take that information from the sensory system into the short-term working memory, where it can be encoded into long-term memory through rehearsal. So when I say short-term memory, order of magnitude in time, how long am I talking about? What's that? Yeah, it's like 20 to 30 seconds. Right? Colloquially, we like to say that short-term memory means a couple days or even a couple hours. But in reality, short-term memory really only means 30 seconds. Right? If you've got something in your short-term memory that you're not rehearsing, you're not working to encode into long-term memory, it's gone. Bye-bye. This is why when you greet somebody and they tell you your name, their name, not your name, that would be weird. Although that happened to me. Quick side note. So I was at the Air Force Academy and had a meeting with a student named Gene. I found out it was Gene. But I thought maybe it's French, maybe it's Jean. And so he came in and I said, "Hi, I'm Jean." He goes, "You're Jean?" I said, "No, I mean, you're Jean." He goes, "No, I'm Gene." I go, "Oh, okay." Very awkwardly off to the side. Yeah. That was an unnecessary tangent, but it makes me cringe every time I think about it, and so I figure if I tell enough people about it, I'll stop cringing. Yeah, so somebody tells you their name, and you have this rehearsal. If you fail to rehearse it, a minute later, you can't remember what their name was, even though they just told you, right? You're not going through that process of encoding. And this happens to me all the time in jiu-jitsu. We have new people come in, I ask them for their name, they tell me their name, and then we start grappling. And then 5 minutes later, I say, "What was your name again?" Happens every time, because again, you're not going through this encoding, or excuse me, this rehearsal process that enhances that encoding. And then with sufficient rehearsal, that information then moves into long-term memory. So again, long-term memory is anything beyond that 30-second buffer, that 30-second threshold of short-term or working memory. So if on an exam, hint, hint, I said memory of things that happened a minute ago are short-term memory or long-term memory, you're going to say long-term memory, yes. And so again, you have this sensory information that's coming in, right? When we talked about sensation and perception, that sensory information is that initial processing of the information, right? It's either happening on your retinas or it's happening in the cochlea. You've got this initial sensory memory. That's what we call kind of really low-level memory. It's inherent to that sensory modality rather than kind of these higher-order cognitive processes. The process by which sensory memory gets put into working memory or short-term memory is attention. Right? And so if I ask you your name and then look away and start focusing on something else and you tell me your name still hit my eardrum, still got processed by my cochlea, but I didn't pay attention to it to then transfer that sensory memory into the working or short-term memory. You then have this rehearsal loop, again, where you're going through it, you're saying their name again and again and again, rehearsing it, thinking about it. Sufficient rehearsal allows it to be encoded into long-term memory. So now, that memory can leave that short-term memory loop and go get stored into long-term memory. Now the process by which you pull from long-term memory into short-term / working memory is called retrieval. And the reason we call it working memory is because we frequently are doing things with that memory that's not just computer-like, right? We're not saying, pull this information, push it out. Pull this information, push it out. Sometimes we're pulling that information and we're thinking about it. Right? I pulled that awkward memory of me telling a guy that my name was his name, but said the wrong way, from my long-term memory, pulled it into my short-term working memory, and then from there I had to think about whether this was a story I should be telling you all. So that process of rehearsal exists during the retrieval. So I pulled the information from long-term memory, it's in my working memory, and I'm continuing to rehearse it until I decide don't need it anymore, and I push it back into long-term memory. So we'll talk about the fallibility of memory, like I said, next time. What is important to understand is kind of a rehearsal loop and the rehearsal loop's role in the fallibility of memory. Right? Because every time I pull that memory from long-term memory into working memory, I'm changing it ever so slightly. Sometimes dramatically. But you may have had this experience wherein you had a dream, that dream gets stored in long-term memory, and you pull that dream out into short-term memory to tell your family about it. And then after enough times pulling it from long-term memory, you start to question whether it was even a dream. Right? You start to have certain doubts of maybe this actually did happen. This happened to my parents in their first year of marriage all the time, where my mom would have a dream that my dad had done something wrong. She would then wake up mad at him, refusing to talk to him, until he was able to convince her that, no, I didn't actually do whatever that was. That was in your dream. So again, that retrieval of information, that rehearsal of information affects your memory for that information. We talk about the brain as if it's a computer all the time, but the problem is, while that's a useful metaphor to some degree, the brain's memory is nothing like a computer's memory. Whereas a computer can replicate a certain image again and again and again and again and again, and you'll have decay over long periods of time, we tend to distort images, we tend to distort memories all the time. I'm sure you also see this where you have a story that you think happened to you, your brother or sister thinks it happened to them, and none of you can agree on it, right? Because of that changing and of that rehearsal. Another thing I don't think we're going to talk about today or next time, but one of the most infuriating things is your confidence in the correctness of your memory has no correlation with the actual correctness of that memory, right? And so you'll get arguments go, I know I'm right, I remember it. It doesn't matter. It has no bearing on whether or not you're actually right. I have found that friends and loved ones don't like it when I point this out, but it is kind of a trump card to win any sort of argument. It's the best. All right, so what are some of the problems you see with the Atkinson and Shiffrin three-stage model? Talk with your neighbor, and then we will bring it all together to discuss.
But she's like, she was there for
43 more seconds. All right, who thinks Atkinson and Schifrin's model is fake news, and why? Or even not fake news, who thinks there are certain things that are wrong with it? Everybody loves it? Yeah.
Right, it's more complex than just
Okay, give me an example. Okay.
I'm just saying that the brain's more complex than just saying it's just short term.
Yeah, right? So we kind of have this intuition that maybe this is a little too parsimonious of a model that doesn't actually describe all the phenomena. We'll give an example of that in just a second. So on the other hand back there. Okay. Yeah, so give me an example.
For example, like a member's complaint a minute ago, but I'm not hearing the same thing it was 3 minutes ago.
Yeah, so it's not accounting for this kind of decay over time. Yeah, exactly. What else? Anything? Well, here are mine. So kind of in that vein of the mind is more complex, there's nothing in between short and long-term memory represented in their model. However, we've all had the experience where we have kind of partial retrieval or this feeling like we know the information, that kind of tip of the tongue phenomena, that it's residing somewhere between that active attention and that long-term storage. Right? You've also got this kind of primed aspect to it, where if I ask you what was the name of the first street you grew up on, it may take you a few minutes to actually recall that, but if I ask you again tomorrow or in a week, you're going to recall it a lot faster, right? And so this model isn't accounting for that fact that there is seemingly something in between this long-term memory storage and this short-term working memory as well. The 3-box model also implies that there's just one short-term and one long-term. But in reality, I don't remember if we've talked about it in math in this class. I don't think we have yet. We can conceptualize kind of these 3 different storages within short-term or working memory. One for vision, one for language. You can also have things like odorant memories. And so we can think about each having this kind of short-term and long-term storage back and forth that allows you to have kind of this running song in your head while also playing kind of a different visual slideshow through your visual spatial sketchpad, as we call it. Questions about that model? Everybody feeling good about it? Cool. So as I alluded to before, our sensory memory system is not just an initial process by which information comes in and it immediately gets thrown to that working memory. Right? We have access to a lot more information than we realize. And it's not just the a priori direction of attention, right? Of saying, okay, noise is going to come from over there. I want to listen to hear what they say. But after an event happens, we can cue our attention after the fact to what just happened and access it as if we had been expecting or waiting for it to happen at the beginning. So the way they tested this is they would show a 3x3 grid of letters, and they put it up for only 1/20th of a second. Right? So short that you can't look through it all. You can't consciously be aware of what that 3x3 grid was. And then they asked participants to recall all of the letters. In reality, they're only able to recall about half of the letters up there when they were asked to recall all of them. But then for a second group, they similarly showed it for 1/20th of a second. And then they immediately cued the participants to a single line or a single column in there right after the fact. So they had already shown the letters disappeared, and then they cued the participants saying, okay, fixate on this left column. And participants were able to recall all the letters in that. Right? And so it's the suggestion that we have access to all of that information. We just have to be cued to pay attention to it after the fact, and we can have access to that information itself. Right? So again, this is the example of somebody says something, you say, what? And then you realize, oh wait, I need to pay attention to what they said. It's rarely the case that you say what when you're paying attention to them. Usually you're off thinking about something else. You say what? And then say, oh wait, no, now that I'm paying attention to what they said, now I've been cued to listen to what they said, I can process it, I paid attention to it, I process it, and now I'm ready to respond. So we can also break our memory into two different categories of implicit and explicit. So explicit memories are memories that you can explicitly state. Right? You can say it out loud. It's a fact. It's information you can share from one person to another by sharing that fact. Sometimes also called declarative memory, things you can declare. So for example, Denver is the capital of Colorado. Whether or not you knew that before, you all know it now. You can recall it, you can regurgitate it just as well as I can in presenting that information to you. Implicit memories are the memories of things you can't just tell somebody and have them know. Right? So think about these as skill-based memories. So for example, shooting a free throw. You know, Steph Curry could come in here, tell us all every little minute detail necessary to shoot a three-pointer, but not a single one of us is going to go out and shoot three-pointers right after the fact just as well as he can. It's that process of acquisition of those skills, that memory that you're developing, even though you can translate that into something declarative or explicit, that doesn't make that declarative or explicit. Those implicit memories are focusing again just on things that I can't tell you and then have you know. Right? So you can think about also things like color. Right? The experience of color, the phenomenological experience of color. If I ask you to think of red, as long as you're not colorblind, you can all think of the color red. But if I told you to describe to me red, you can't do it, right? I mean, you can try to ascribe emotion to it, feelings to it, warmth to it, etc. But you can't actually give me the experience of red, barring my experience of it as well. So somebody give me another example of an explicit memory. Yeah. Oh. Confused. Anything? Yeah. Yeah, 2 plus 2 is 4.
Trump was elected in 2016.
Yeah, things like Trump was elected in 2016. Things like the fun fact of the day. Things like what I'm telling you in class. Somebody give me an example of an implicit memory that they have.
Playing the piano.
What's that?
Playing the piano.
Playing the piano. Yeah. Somebody give me another one.
Typing.
Typing. Yeah. So I can tell you how to type, but it's not until you actually learn how to either play the piano or learn how to type that you have that implicit memory. Good. So there are also these kind of effortful processing strategies for learning information. And I'm sure a lot of y'all have used these, even if you don't know them by name, to actually learn information or to remember information as well. The three things we're going to go over, and actually I didn't include one on here that we're going to go over. Chunking, mnemonics, and hierarchies. The other thing we're going to talk about is the method of loci, however you want to say it. So chunking is a process by which you're breaking up bigger sources of information into smaller, more manageable, quote-unquote, chunks. So if I told you to remember this string of numbers 2022194517762001, chances nobody in here would have been able to recall that right off the bat. But if you were able to chunk those into meaningful years, so let's say you're set to graduate in 2022, 1945, 1776, 2001, right? Those 4 sets of numbers in a row all have meaning to them. So now it becomes a lot easier if I said 2022, 1945, 1776, and 2001 for you all to regurgitate those 16 numbers where you wouldn't have been able to before. This is also why we tend to present phone numbers in the way we do, right? You don't just give 10 digits for a phone number. You break it up. And to avoid giving you my phone number, we'll make one up. 867-5309, right? It becomes really easy to remember those numbers. It also works on letters. Right? And so if I'm asking you to, for example, grade the exams, you would come in and instead of remembering DAB, BCAA, you would break it up into DAB, so DAB, that makes it easy, and then BCAA, and you can use other mnemonics for that as well. This is also why license plates tend to be broken up. It becomes a lot easier to remember a license plate if it's split up than if it's just 7 continuous numbers. Mnemonics are things like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. What is that?
Order of operation.
Yeah, order of operations, PEMDAS. Parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. Things like my very educated mother just served us noodles. What's that one? Anybody know? It's the planets, yeah. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. No Pluto, sorry. And of course, I hope I don't have to actually log into this. Uh-oh. And we're giving this 5 more seconds. If it doesn't work, we're jumping ship.
And they displayed a pattern
There we go.
of disrespect and inappropriate behavior.
Yes, yes. Pattern. My friend Pat took a turn. That's how I remember that. Can we pull over and put that on the top? I'm feeling a little queasy.
I want it up, my hair.
Well,
But remember, it's not just a pattern, it's a pattern of disrespect and inappropriate behavior.
Disray. My friend Disray got new specs. Disray spec. My friend Inapro drives a Prius with his behind neighbor.
Is this work for you?
Yep. How much you're gonna get for it?
Michael, that's
$1 million.
$4 million.
$4 million! That is a lot of guacamole.
So, mnemonics allowing him to remember his deposition even though he's not supposed to remember it. There are a whole bunch of other less appropriate examples of him using mnemonics to, for example, remember people's names. But yeah, so it's just using these sorts of word games or kind of manipulations of information to allow you to remember what it is you're supposed to remember. Does anybody have a particularly good mnemonic device that they use? Yeah.
Prindle.
What?
Prindle.
Prindle?
If anyone here used to watch Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, you know that's how you remember the gear shift. Prindle. The Prindle.
I didn't watch it, so Wait, how does that help you with the gear shift?
We call it a Prindle. Park, reverse, neutral, drive.
Ah, yes, okay, there you go. I was thinking like a manual car. Yeah. Roy G. Biv, yes, that's a big one. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, the visible spectrum. Yes. See, you'll realize that your entire life has been gearing you up for this one class with mnemonic devices you've learned. So the method of loci, loci, however you want to say it, is what people use in these kind of memory championships, right? If you want to get lost down a rabbit hole, go watch the world records of people remembering a deck of cards. So what they'll do is they'll shuffle up a deck of cards, put it in a box, and then have somebody pull it out and remember the order of the cards. The current world record is 12.74 seconds to memorize an entire deck of cards. It's unbelievable. I think he goes through it faster than I can physically go through it, and then they have to regurgitate it by flipping over correct cards for another deck. And so what they're doing is creating a story map. A mental map of places, of rooms, of people. So for example, every suit of the cards will be a different room in their house. And each of the numbers represent a different person. Or a different person from a different stage in their life or family, things like that. And so now what they'll do is use visual imagery to walk through their house. Now I go into the living room and there's my brother. I go into the kitchen and there's my uncle. And back into the living room and there's my mom, etc. Going through to actually recall this. So again, what they're actually remembering is not necessarily the cards, but the association between the cards and whatever they have ascribed to it. This is one of the coolest studies, I think, ever in my mind. But hierarchies, it's just detailing the process, or that we process information in a way wherein a few concepts are divided and subdivided into narrower concepts and facts. So we have two different board games here. The game on the left is representative of a chess game that would actually play out. Right? There is a systematic way in which each of these pieces would have gotten to those spots in a way that makes sense to a chess expert. On the right-hand side, They just placed chess pieces in random spots. And then they brought in novices and chess experts, showed them the boards, and then asked them to recall the boards. And what they showed is for the actual game, again, the configuration of pieces in a way that would make sense, the chess experts were performing better than were the novices in the actual recall of the game. Now you could say, well, obviously they have more experience, they know the different pieces, they're not having to spend so much time thinking about all the configurations. But when they showed the chess experts and the novices this random configuration of the board, there was no difference in performance of recall. Right? And so what the chess experts were doing is not necessarily just remembering, okay, rook in this spot, knight in this spot. I don't know if that's, I guess the queen, king, I don't know. In that spot. But they were remembering the hierarchy, the relationship between these different pieces on the board. Right? So it wasn't just this kind of rote memorization of what was on the board, but the relationships between everything. And this is what allows various chess masters to play multiple games at any given time just by telling them where to move pieces without actually looking at the board. So as we've talked about, your best bet when studying is to space out your studying. So distributed practice leads to substantially better recall than would what we call mass practice. So mass practice would be studying for 5 hours all at one time. Distributed practice would be studying for 30 minutes a day over a long period of time. And what's great is you can actually have enhanced recall when you're not studying for the same amount of time if you're splitting it up. Alright, so this is again another efficiency thing wherein if you make flashcards and you have 5 minutes before class, just study those 5 minutes before class and you're enhancing your recall because now you've split up that study. You're also having the testing effect there, but you are spreading out that study period to allow you to recall it with greater clarity down the line. And so the testing effect we've already talked about, but the additional benefit of the testing effect is you can't BS yourself, right? So not only does it enhance your recall for information by practicing that recall, it also doesn't allow you to say, yeah, I know this material. Right? One of the hardest lessons I learned in college was how to not just go through rereading the book, because I had a massive ego tied to this idea of, yeah, I'll be fine. We'll be good. Right? So you look at information, you say, yeah, I recognize that. No duh, right? I can pull that out easily. But then you get to the test, you're like, well, didn't know that one. Right? And so, by testing yourself, you have the enhanced recall, but you're also forcing yourself to come to terms with what you do need to restudy to be able to enhance for the next time you actually test. Now, every year, I give that same spiel, and I inevitably get some student who says, you know, Dr. T, I know that's what the data say, but for me, it actually works a lot better if I just study the night before. No, that's not how that works. I'm sorry. You all are special in your own ways, but your brain is not special to the point where you're not having a benefit for spacing study or for not using the testing effect. So if you come to my office, and we go over your exam, and we start talking about study strategies, after this exam, we've all learned good study strategies, but after the next exam, you come to me and say, Dr. T, I don't know what happened. I studied for 12 hours for this exam, and I still only got a D on it. I'm going to ask you how you studied. And if you don't tell me you spaced out your studying, and you use a testing effect to your advantage, I may just hand in my letter of resignation on the spot and leave UAH and y'all without an instructor. Don't make me do that. All right, so another critical thinking activity. Freshman forgets a lot, has been having a really hard time with his art history class. He can't keep straight the difference between Rembrandt, Picasso, Matisse, Pollock, and Monet. What advice could you give him on how to prepare for the upcoming exam he has? Talk with your neighbor, and then we will bring it all together.
Because it is art, so trying to match it so they can use visual, what colors.
Uh, 26 more seconds. Nope. Completely incapable of doing so. All right, do we actually have any art majors in here? All right. So, what are some of the things, if you know, you're allowed to say you don't know, that would distinguish some of these artists from one another?
If you look at a piece and you just go, what's going on here? It's probably Picasso. Anything else, I don't know.
Okay.
It's just,
Yeah. So you could think about like the Cubism of Picasso or the drip paintings of Jackson Pollock. I'm sure you all have seen Jackson Pollock. It looks like what you did in grade school. That's what it does. I recreated it in grade school. Interesting fact, this is tangential and you won't be tested on this, but I feel like it's important to tell you anyways because I think it's cool. So if you look at Jackson Pollock's paintings over time, he used to be much more of a realist painting, right? And so his paintings represented a lot more of what you would kind of consider typical art. But he had bipolar disorder. And one of the ways we used to treat bipolar disorder, and still do to some degree today, is with lithium. And lithium, one of the side effects is tremors. And so you can watch this progression of his art, apparently, which coincides with his progression of treatment of bipolar disorder, such that as apparently his tremors got worse, he started doing less of these kind of realist paintings and moving on to things like drip paintings. So, yeah.
Picasso also used to be a realist painter, but no one knows why he changed to whatever he does.
Maybe it was lithium. I don't know. All right. So back to the actual topic at hand. What study strategies are you going to give freshmen forgets a lot? Yeah.
one thing that I used in my art history class was I would just give them each like one or two things that were like specific to them, and then it would be like, oh, if I look at a painting and it's these two things, then it's probably this person.
Yeah. So first off, you have to be able to discriminate what you're even looking for, right? What else? What other study strategies? Yeah. Okay, how so?
Just like, actually, I think I meant loci. Just like assign something to each name, try to identify it by that. That's how I.
Yeah, absolutely. What else would we do? Yeah.
mnemonic device.
Okay, how so?
Okay, Rembrandt painted extremely detailed pieces from memory. Remember Rembrandt.
Oh, that's
He
good.
also had a lot of shapes. His paintings were divided into pieces. Peak, Picasso. Pollock's paintings were really messy and shocking. A lot of people would call them appalling.
This is amazing.
So, which is worth more money than as any other painting. Monet, money.
That's remarkable. Well done, man. That was really good.
I think you've got a prodigy.
Yeah. Anything I'm going to tell you of how to study kind of pales in comparison to that. I'm going to remember that for each one of these. Yeah, so one thing you would do, obviously space it out. You would also test yourself, right? You would show those pictures. But there's also a benefit for what we call interleaving, right? So it doesn't make sense to study all of Rembrandt's, try to get to the point where you can recognize Rembrandt, and then study all of Picasso. Remember all of Picasso. It makes sense to put them in with one another because now you're having to fixate on the different components of each of their art, which allows you to have better discriminability down the line. So there's also this concept of levels of processing. All right, the suggestion is that you can have shallow processing all the way on to deep levels of processing, and the depth with which you process information predicts how well you're going to recall that information. So if I give you a word, and I ask you, is that word written in capital letters? And then ask you, minutes or hours down the line to tell me what that word was, you're not likely to recall it because the suggestion is that you've processed it at kind of the shallow level, right? It's only the appearance of the word with which you are concerned. The kind of middle level of processing would be, does that word rhyme with something, right? And so you're having some degree of processing of that word, but you're not necessarily fixating on anything more meaningful than things like the rhyming of the word. And then the suggested deepest level of processing is the semantic meaning of a word. Right? And so if I give you the word cow and I ask you if you would find that at the aquarium, right? You're having to think critically about what it is that constitutes a cow and whether or not it would make sense to be in an aquarium. You may also think of things like sea cows, which will then help you with the visual imagery. But the whole suggestion of the levels of processing account is that the depth of that processing is going to enhance the recall after the fact. Now you may have noticed I've been kind of providing some sort of out here of saying the claim is, or the suggestion is, now we're going to skip that because we just did critical thinking, of the levels of processing account. And people love this account. If anybody in here is an education major or wants to go into teaching, you inevitably will be given this account a whole bunch and told, yeah, you really need to help your students process at a deeper level. The problem is there are some kind of fatal flaws with the theory. And so this is one of those cases where I care less about your understanding of the theory and more of your ability to think critically about these theories. So the first problem is it has no mechanism. It doesn't explain how this quote-unquote deeper level of processing results in greater memory. It doesn't tell you why that happens. Also, the deeper processing takes more effort, right? And so maybe it's just an effort effect. There's nothing really all that relevant about the depth, so to speak. But what matters more is how much effort an individual is putting in to that. Finally, depth is inherently ill-defined, right? We can't objectively measure what depth is, and thus for us to define whether or not something was processed deeply or at a certain level of depth, the logic becomes self-referential. It becomes circular logic. Right? So to illustrate this, we say, okay, what was the level of processing? We'll say deep level of processing enhances that the word will be recalled, enhances the likelihood that the word will be recalled. Well, how do we know that was deep processing? It's because the word was recalled, right? And so all we're doing here is establishing a circular form of logic that doesn't allow us to a priori or ahead of time define how deep something is. Right? If I asked you outside of the context of what I've already told you, whether or not something's likely to be recalled, there's no grounding, there's no foundation upon which you can say, yeah, that's deep processing. The things that we say are deep processing are the things that are recalled. Things that aren't recalled are the things we say are not deep processing. If you want to be an inquiring skeptic about a lot of science, not just in psychology, but across different disciplines, understanding, I think, two different principles will allow you to evaluate whether or not a lot of this research or a lot of the way society talks about this research is sound. One is this kind of circular reasoning, right? People still love this levels of processing model because it has some intuitive appeal, right? We can kind of tie in this effort with the depth of processing, and it's nice, it's clear. Okay, don't just look at the word, understand the word, understand the concept, and you're more likely to recall it. But understanding when you become self-referential is important. The other thing is Hume's guillotine, but that's more of a philosophical thing. But yeah, understanding this kind of circular logic will help guard you against a lot of bad theories that in and of themselves are fatally flawed. Bless you. Questions about what we covered today? So next week, we're going to be talking about learning, and I'm still debating whether or not to do this, but in years past, I've brought my dogs in and had the class use what they've learned in the learning lectures to teach them new tricks. They're hypoallergenic, so you wouldn't have to worry about it if you're allergic to dogs. But let me know if you have a particular phobia of dogs. I'm not promising I'm going to bring them in. But let me know if you have a phobia of dogs so we can figure it out. Yeah, so, the end.
Yeah, my dairy company, that's a really big.
Yeah, 65-ish pounds.
Do they jump?
They're not supposed to.